Old Jim, a reclusive fisherman, dives into icy waters to save a drowning stranger at dawn. The man, barely conscious, bears a mysterious Navy tattoo. Word spreads in Portside, twisting Jim's heroism into suspicion. Whispers of smugglers and drugs haunt him, and he's forced from his marina. Days later, a cryptic note arrives, hinting at the stranger's powerful identity. As Jim grapples with isolation, Navy officers approach his pier, revealing a larger, classified truth. Who was the man Jim saved, and what secrets does he carry? The fog thickens, pulling Jim into a storm of intrigue. If Jim's courage inspired you, support our channel. Subscribe to hear more stories of unsung heroes. Hit the bell icon for daily doses of righteousness. Share your own tale of doing the right thing in the comments. Let's honor those who act with heart. Join us today. In the quiet, frost-kissed dawn of Cooper's Bay, where the world seems suspended in a delicate balance between night and day, old Jim toiled alone. His hands, roughened by years of battling the sea's relentless pull, moved with a practiced grace as he mended his fishing nets. His small cabin, perched precariously on stilts at the bay's edge, stood as a testament to his chosen solitude. For nearly 15 years, since the ache of his wife's absence had carved a hollow in his chest, Jim had lived apart from the world. The people of Portside, the nearby coastal town, knew him as a man of few words, a ghost who haunted the edges of their community, content with the company of the tides. His life was simple, governed by the sea's rhythms, and he guarded that simplicity fiercely, shunning the messy entanglements of human connection. As the first light of dawn spilled across the horizon, casting the water in shades of amber and shadow, a faint cry pierced the stillness. Jim's head jerked up, his sharp eyes cutting through the heavy mist that draped the bay. Some 50 yards out, a figure battled the current, arms thrashing in a desperate bid for survival. A head sank beneath the waves only to break the surface again, gasping. Jim's mind churned with possibilities, each one laced with caution. Some drunk who stumbled off a pleasure boat, no doubt, or worse, trouble I don't need. The tide's a beast today. Yet, even as doubt gnawed at him, his body moved before his thoughts could catch up. He let his nets fall, kicked off his weathered boots, and dove into the frigid water. The cold was a living thing, wrapping around his chest and squeezing until his lungs burned. Each stroke against the current was a struggle, the sea pulling at him with a force that seemed personal, as if it resented his intrusion. But Jim knew these waters, had faced their wrath countless times. He swam at an angle, letting the tide carry him toward the struggling figure. "Hold on!" he called, his voice barely rising above the water's roar. The man was slipping under again, his movements growing feeble when Jim reached him. Grasping the man's soaked jacket, Jim pulled with all his strength, locking an arm across his chest. The stranger was heavy, unresponsive, a dead weight against the waves. Jim's muscles screamed, his heart pounding with a mix of exertion and something deeper, a quiet, primal fear that he might fail, that this life might slip through his hands. The shore seemed impossibly far, but Jim fought for every inch, his strokes deliberate despite the exhaustion creeping into his bones. When his feet finally grazed the rocky bottom, he dragged the man onto the beach, collapsing beside him. The stranger lay still, his chest unmoving. A flicker of panic sparked in Jim's chest, an unfamiliar intruder in a heart that had weathered loss and loneliness without breaking. He rolled the man onto his side, striking between his shoulder blades with force. Nothing. Turning him over, Jim pressed his interlocked hands against the man's sternum, counting compressions through clenched teeth. "Come on," he growled, his voice thick with defiance. "Not here. Not on my shore. Not today." Each push was a plea, each second a battle against the specter of failure. Then, at last, the man's body jerked, water spilling from his mouth as he gasped for air. Jim sank back, his breath coming in heavy, uneven bursts, relief washing over him like a tide. When the stranger could sit, Jim helped him to his feet, guiding him to the cabin. The small space smelled of salt and wood smoke, a refuge from the world outside. Jim stoked the stove until its warmth filled the room, wrapping the man in a thick wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. As he helped the stranger out of his sodden shirt, Jim's gaze caught on a faded tattoo across the man's left shoulder. USN, paired with an insignia that stirred a memory from Jim's own brief Navy days. It wasn't just any mark, it belonged to someone of high rank, a detail that piqued Jim's curiosity even as he pushed it aside. Questions were a slippery slope, and he'd spent years avoiding such entanglements. The stranger's voice, when it came, was rough but steady. "Thank you," he said, his eyes holding Jim's with an intensity that carried more than words. Jim nodded, his response gruff. "You need a hospital." The man's refusal was swift, cutting. No. The word was a wall, shutting out further discussion. No hospitals, no reports, just a quiet, unshakable resolve. Jim didn't argue. He set a pot of coffee to boil, its bitter scent mingling with the warmth of the stove, and watched as the stranger's trembling hands gripped the mug. The man's silence mirrored Jim's own, but beneath it, Jim sensed a current of unspoken thoughts. Secrets, perhaps, or burdens too heavy to share. "Who are you?" Jim wondered, the question circling in his mind like a gull over the bay. But he kept it locked away, as he always did. By nightfall, the stranger had regained enough strength to stand, though the wind outside howled, rattling the cabin's windows like a warning. "I need to go," he said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion still etched into his face. Jim didn't protest. He packed a small bag, bread, dried fish, an apple, and handed it over without a word. The stranger paused at the door, his figure framed against the deepening dark. "Few would have done what you did," he said, his tone carrying a weight of certainty. Jim shrugged, uneasy with the acknowledgement. Anyone would. The stranger's eyes held his, unyielding. No, they wouldn't. Then he stepped into the night, his form swallowed by the fog, leaving only the echo of his words. Jim stood on his pier, the weathered boards groaning under his weight, staring into the darkness where the stranger had vanished. The bay stretched before him, its surface calm but deceptive, hiding currents that could pull a man under without mercy. For the first time in years, Jim felt the weight of his solitude shift, stirred by questions he hadn't asked and answers he might never know. Had he saved a man, or something more? A secret, a storm, a shadow from a world he'd left behind? By midday, the story had spread through Portside, a spark catching in the dry grass of a town that thrived on gossip. Old Jim, the recluse who spoke only when necessary, had pulled a stranger from the bay at dawn. The tale grew with each retelling, carried on the lips of fishermen and shopkeepers. When Jim docked his boat to sell his modest catch, Russ, the market manager, greeted him with a sly grin. "Heard you played hero today," he said, sliding bills into Jim's rough palm. Jim's reply was curt, as always. "Just helped someone who needed it." Russ leaned closer, his voice low. "Mighty brave." "Who was he?" Jim pocketed the money, his expression a closed door. Didn't ask. But in Portside, silence was as good as fuel. By afternoon, the story had twisted, taking on a life of its own. At the general store, Dolores whispered to her husband, her voice thick with suspicion. "That old hermit's hiding something. Nobody just falls into the bay at dawn." Her husband nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Smugglers, maybe. Remember those drug busts up north last summer?" The looks Jim received as he passed through town were no longer just curious. They were sharp, searching, as if the townsfolk believed he'd pulled a mystery from the sea and was keeping it to himself. Jim felt their stares, heavy with unspoken accusations, and his steps quickened. He'd done what was right, but in doing so, he'd stirred something restless in Portside, something that wouldn't easily fade. The air in the small coastal town had turned thick with suspicion, a shift as subtle yet undeniable as the changing tides. Jim Walker, a fisherman whose weathered face bore the lines of decades at sea, felt the weight of unfamiliar eyes tracking his every move. Neighbors who once passed him with nothing more than a nod now stared, their gazes sharp with curiosity or something colder. Distrust. Some crossed the street when they saw him, their hurried steps echoing like accusations. The change stirred a quiet unease in Jim's chest, a pang of confusion and hurt. He'd lived here for years, blending into the rhythm of the town like the gulls overhead. Yet now he felt like an outsider in his own home. 2 days after the whispers began, Malcolm Pierce, the grizzled owner of the marina where Jim had docked his boat for over a decade, approached him. Malcolm's face was etched with discomfort, his eyes avoiding Jim's as he rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous tic Jim remembered from their younger days. Back then they'd shared beers after long fishing trips, their laughter mingling with the sound of waves under starlit skies. Those memories felt distant now, replaced by the awkward tension between them. "Jim," Malcolm began, his voice low and halting, "there's a situation. The town's all riled up with this talk going around. The Coast Guard's been asking questions, poking into things. I can't have complications at the marina." He paused, shifting his weight, the words clearly heavy on his tongue. "I think it's best if you move your boat somewhere else. Just temporary, you know." Jim stood still, his calloused hands resting at his sides as the words sank in. He glanced at the slip where Sarah's pride had sat for 11 years, its weathered hull a testament to countless days on the water. He thought of Sarah, his late wife, her laughter bright as sunlight on their first boat together, her hair dancing in the sea breeze. Malcolm's request wasn't just about the boat. It was a crack in the bond they'd forged over years, a betrayal dressed in practicality. "I understand," Jim said, his voice soft but steady, hiding the sting that tightened his throat. He didn't argue or beg. Instead, he gathered his belongings from the marina locker, a jumble of spare tackle, a salt-stiffened jacket, and a faded photograph of Sarah, her smile radiant on the deck of their first boat. Each item felt heavier than it should, as if carrying the weight of the life he was being pushed out of. He moved Sarah's pride to the old pier near his cabin, a crumbling stretch of wood that groaned underfoot and offered little protection from the Atlantic's storms. The walk was longer, the solitude sharper, but it was his own space, untainted by the town's judgment. That evening, as he sat mending a torn fishing net by the flickering glow of a kerosene lamp, his thoughts swirled like the sea beyond his window. He'd acted out of instinct, pulling a man from the icy bay, a simple act of humanity. Yet somehow that moment of decency had twisted into something sinister, casting a shadow over his quiet life. He wondered how kindness could be so easily misunderstood, how a single choice could unravel the world he'd built since Sarah's death. 3 days passed in near silence, the only sounds the wind rattling his cabin's windows and the distant cries of gulls. On the fourth morning, he found an envelope wedged into the crack of his cabin door. It was plain, unmarked, without a postmark or return address, yet its presence felt like a stone dropped into still water. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its message brief but heavy with implication. "Thank you for not asking questions. If you ever need anything, call this number." Below was a string of digits, and at the bottom, the words CDR Atlantic Command. The note sent a chill through him, not from fear but from the sense of stepping into something vast and unknowable. He folded it carefully, placing it in the wooden box where he kept Sarah's final letter, written in her trembling hand from the hospital before cancer claimed her. That box was his refuge, a place for things too sacred to lose, and now it held a secret that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The following Saturday, Jim ventured into town for supplies, his steps heavy with the awareness of being watched. At the hardware store, as he waited for his order, a man in a faded veteran's cap caught his eye from across the counter. Bill Thornton, a Gulf War veteran known for his gruff demeanor and solitary ways, leaned in close. "Walker," he said, his voice low and edged with intrigue, "word is you pulled more than cod out of the bay the other morning." Jim's jaw tightened, but he offered a slight nod, unwilling to feed the rumors that had already taken root. Bill's eyes flicked around the store as if checking for eavesdroppers before he continued. "That tattoo you told Russ about, an eagle clutching an anchor, 3 stars above it?" Jim hadn't mentioned any tattoo, not to Russ or anyone, but gossip in a small town had a life of its own. "Might have been," he said, his tone cautious, revealing nothing. Bill leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not just any tattoo. I saw it once, years back, on an admiral who visited our carrier group. Admiral Harrison. But here's the kicker." He paused, glancing around again, his eyes sharp with unease. "Harrison's been missing for 6 months. Some classified operation gone wrong." Jim kept his expression neutral, but his mind was a storm, replaying the moment in the bay, the man's labored breathing, the faint tattoo glimpsed in the dawn light. As he walked back to his pier, the weight of Bill's words settled over him, heavier than the bags of supplies slung over his shoulder. Whatever he'd stumbled into was no longer just a town rumor. It was something far larger, pulling him into currents he wasn't sure he could navigate. A week later, as dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, Jim heard footsteps on the creaking boards of his pier. He'd been awake for an hour, repairing a trolling line by the dim glow of his kerosene lamp, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of years at sea. He looked up to see three figures approaching, their steps synchronized with a precision that marked them as military before the rising sun revealed their crisp naval uniforms. The lead officer, a tall woman with commander's insignia gleaming on her chest, stepped forward and offered a formal salute. "Mr. James Walker," she said, her voice calm yet authoritative. "We're from Naval Command Headquarters. We'd like to request your presence at the North Harbor Naval Facility. It's not mandatory, but it would be greatly appreciated." Jim set down his net needle, wiping his hands on his worn pants as he rose to his feet. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with wariness. The officer's face remained composed, her eyes meeting his with respect. "I'm not at liberty to discuss details here, but I assure you you're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite." The words hung between them, a promise wrapped in mystery. Jim nodded, sensing that pushing for answers now would yield nothing. The naval base was a 40-minute drive, hidden behind towering fences along a secluded stretch of coastline. Security was unyielding, IDs checked with precision, his truck inspected, escorts assigned with quiet efficiency. They led him to an unmarked building near the water, where the air carried the sharp tang of salt and diesel. Inside a small conference room, a man in a pristine dress uniform entered, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. Jim recognized him immediately. Mimawandi, the same face he'd pulled from the bay, now transformed by the starched white uniform and the weight of command. "Mr. Walker," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Rear Admiral Thomas Harrison. We've met under less formal circumstances." His voice held a warmth that eased Jim's tension, though his guard remained up. Harrison gestured to a chair. "What I'm about to tell you is classified, but you've earned the right to know." As they sat, Harrison's demeanor shifted, his eyes sharp with purpose. "6 months ago, I was leading an internal investigation into supply chain corruption. Military equipment vanishing, turning up in places it shouldn't. I uncovered evidence that pointed to something bigger, something dangerous." His voice dropped, as if the walls themselves might betray them. Jim listened, his hands clasped tightly, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He'd saved a man's life, but in doing so, he'd stepped into a world far beyond his quiet cabin in the open sea, a world where secrets carried the weight of storms. The Admiral's face grew shadowed, his eyes carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much betrayal. Just 3 weeks before Jim had stumbled upon him, he'd been ambushed during what should have been a routine, heavily guarded transport. His own security team, men he'd trusted with his life, had been compromised. Drugged and disoriented, he was spirited away aboard a shadowy vessel, his captors assuming the ocean's currents would erase their crime, carrying his body far from prying eyes. The Admiral's voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief as he recounted the ordeal, his hands clenching as if to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to spill over. The sting of betrayal cut deeper than the physical wounds. It was the realization that those sworn to protect him had orchestrated his downfall. Jim sat across from him, his weathered face a mask of stoic calm, though his sharp eyes missed nothing. Years spent battling the unpredictable sea had taught him to read people as easily as he read the tides. He didn't flinch or interrupt as the Admiral spoke, but inside his mind churned. The story wasn't just about an ambush. It was about a world where loyalty could be bought and sold, where power corrupted even the most sacred bonds. Jim had seen his share of hardship, but this level of deceit stirred something in his gut, a quiet indignation he hadn't felt in years. The Admiral leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Jim's. "I was barely conscious, drifting in and out, the cold water biting at my skin. I thought that was it, that the sea would claim me. But then you showed up." His voice softened, thick with gratitude he struggled to articulate. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for my rank, my name, or what I'd done to end up half dead in the water. You just acted." You pulled me from the jaws of death when no one else would have dared. The room fell silent, the only sound the distant rhythm of waves crashing against the shore, a reminder of the vast, uncaring sea that had nearly swallowed the Admiral whole. He placed a heavy hand on Jim's shoulder, his touch firm but warm, as if anchoring himself to the one person who had proven incorruptible. We've caught the ones responsible, he continued, but this whole mess has exposed something rotten in our ranks. Too many follow orders blindly, never questioning the cost to their souls. We need to fix that. Another officer stepped forward, his silver hair catching the dim light, his chest adorned with the stars of an admiral's rank. His presence commanded attention, but his eyes held a quiet respect as he addressed Jim. Mr. Walker, we're offering you a role as a civilian ethics consultant for our officer training program. Not as a soldier, not as one of us, but as a man who understands that doing what's right doesn't always align with protocol. His words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the room, a recognition of Jim's quiet heroism. The offer wasn't just a job, it was an acknowledgement of a moral compass that had guided Jim when others had lost their way. Jim's eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise breaking through his usual impassivity. It was the most emotion he'd shown in years, a subtle crack in the armor he'd built from years of solitude and self-reliance. I'm just a fisherman, he said, his voice low and rough, like the gravel paths leading to his cabin. The words weren't a refusal, but a reflection of the life he'd chosen, a life of simplicity, where the sea was both his adversary and his solace. Exactly, the Admiral replied, his eyes glinting with conviction. A fisherman who didn't hesitate to risk his life for a stranger. You didn't ask questions, didn't demand a reward, didn't seek glory. Those are the values we're desperate to instill in our people. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jim felt the weight of them, stirring memories of a life spent doing what needed to be done. Not for praise, but because it was right. The Admiral's voice softened, but his resolve remained firm. We need men like you to remind us what integrity looks like. The senior admiral cleared his throat, drawing Jim's attention. We've also looked into the situation at the marina, he said, his tone formal but tinged with regret. Mr. Pierce has been officially reprimanded for his actions. Your docking privileges have been fully reinstated, should you choose to return. Jim's mind flashed to Malcolm Pierce's uneasy expression, the whispers that had followed him through town, the sidelong glances at the cross street where the locals gathered to gossip. The marina had once been his haven, but it had soured with time, tainted by petty rivalries in small-town politics. I prefer my own pier, Jim said simply, his voice steady but resolute. It's where I belong. The Admiral nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't press the issue, respecting the fisherman's quiet determination to carve his own path. As the meeting drew to a close, the Admiral led Jim to a window overlooking the docks below. A sleek patrol vessel gleamed in the sunlight, smaller than the towering warships in the distance, but no less striking. That's the USS Intrigue, the Admiral said, a note of pride in his voice. Commissioned just last month. Tomorrow, she sets sail on her first patrol. He turned to Jim, his expression earnest. We'd be honored if you'd join us for the ceremony as our guest of honor. Jim's gaze lingered on the ship, watching the sailors move with purpose across its deck, the American flag snapping sharply in the breeze. For the first time in years, something stirred deep within him, a faint but undeniable sense of connection to something greater than himself, something beyond the solitary rhythm of his days at sea. I'll think about it, he said, the words carrying more weight than any promise he'd made in years. It wasn't a yes, but it was more than he'd given anyone in a long time. Before dawn the next morning, a single military jeep rolled quietly down the dirt road to Jim's cabin, its headlights slicing through the pre-dawn mist. Unlike the formal procession of the previous day, this was a solitary gesture, understated but profound. A young sailor stepped out, his movements careful and deliberate, carrying a neatly folded bundle in his arms. He approached the cabin with a reverence that seemed out of place in the quiet, rugged surroundings, placing the bundle gently on the weathered porch steps. He offered no knock, no announcement, only a moment of silent respect as he stood at attention, saluted the humble cabin, and then slipped back into the darkness as quietly as he'd come. When Jim opened his door an hour later, coffee mug in hand, the sight stopped him cold. There, on the steps, was a perfectly folded American flag, encased in a triangular display. Beside it rested a small brass plaque, its inscription simple but piercing. "You don't need to boast, but your country knows who you are." Jim's weathered face softened, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, a smile he'd almost forgotten how to form. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers brushing the flag with a tenderness that surprised even him. As he stood there, looking out at the sea that had shaped his life, he felt a quiet pride he hadn't known he could still feel. Young Tommy, the 8-year-old from the neighboring property who sometimes helped Jim sort his catch, came wandering down the path, his curiosity as boundless as ever. The boy stopped short when he saw the flag in Jim's hands, his young face shifting from confusion to recognition. Without a word, he straightened his small frame, placed his hand over his heart, and stood tall, just as he'd been taught in school. Jim met the boy's gaze and gave a slow nod, acknowledging the gesture. There were no grand speeches, no cheering crowds, just a quiet moment of understanding between a grizzled fisherman and a child who saw something worth honoring. By midday, something had shifted in Portside. The town's usual whispers, once laced with suspicion, carried a new tone, one of quiet respect. Jim felt it when he walked into town for supplies, the weight of curious stares replaced by subtle nods and murmured greetings. Outside the general store, Malcolm Pierce approached, his usual swagger replaced by an awkward shuffle. "Heard about what really happened," he said, his voice low, almost sheepish. He extended a hand, an olive branch in the form of a hesitant handshake. "Your spot at the marina. It's still there if you want it." Jim took the hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. "I'm content where I am," he said, his words carrying the weight of a man who had found his place in the world and had no need to prove it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in the vibrant hues of orange and purple, Jim stood on his pier, the flag and plaque resting on the small table beside him. The sea stretched out before him, vast and unchanging, yet something within him felt different. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. The ocean had always been his companion, but now it seemed his country had taken notice of the man who had never asked for its attention. On a weathered pier that stretched like an old friend into the calm expanse of the bay, Jim sat quietly, his gnarled hands cradling a well-worn pipe. The scent of tobacco mingled with the salty tang of the sea, a familiar comfort that wrapped around him like a warm coat on this crisp evening. The horizon was painted in hues of amber and violet, the sun dipping low, casting a golden path across the water. Jim's eyes, etched with the lines of a life spent squinting against the glare of the sea, traced the gentle ripples lapping at the pier's pilings. This was his sanctuary, a place where the world's clamor faded, leaving only the rhythm of the tides and the occasional cry of a gull. In the distance, a small patrol boat cut through the water, its engine a low hum that barely disturbed the stillness. Jim noticed it at first as a mere speck, a routine sight in these waters. But then, almost imperceptibly, the boat adjusted its course, veering slightly closer to his modest dock. His brow furrowed, curiosity stirring in his chest. What business did they have with him? A solitary fisherman whose days were marked by nets and bait rather than grand affairs. As the boat drew nearer, its silhouette sharpened against the fading light, and Jim's heart quickened, not with fear, but with a quiet sense of something significant unfolding. The sailors on deck came into view, their figures rigid and purposeful. To Jim's astonishment, they stood at attention, their faces turned toward his unassuming pier. Their posture was one of reverence, a silent tribute that seemed to bridge the gap between their world of duty and his of solitude. One sailor, younger than the rest, his face bronzed by the sun, raised a hand in a crisp salute. The gesture was deliberate, weighted with meaning Jim couldn't yet grasp. His breath caught, a flicker of pride and confusion mingling in his chest. Who was he to warrant such respect? His life had been one of quiet labor, of hauling fish and mending nets, not of heroics or fanfare. Slowly, Jim rose from his weathered chair, his joints protesting as he straightened his stooped frame. The years had bent him, carved lines into his face like the grooves of the sea on the shore, but he stood as tall as his body allowed. He didn't return the salute, not out of disrespect, but because he was no soldier, no man of ranks or medals. Instead, he lifted his hand, palm open, in a gesture of simple acknowledgement. It was a sailor's greeting, one born of the shared language of the sea, where words were often unnecessary. Across the divide of water, a fleeting connection formed, a moment of mutual respect that felt like a quiet vow. The boat continued on, its wake rippling gently toward the pier, and Jim stood there a moment longer, watching it disappear into the twilight. His heart was heavy with thoughts he couldn't quite name, a mix of humility, gratitude, and a nagging sense of unworthiness. What had he done to earn such a gesture? He was just a man, living out his days in the shadow of a life he'd once shared with someone who saw the world with clearer eyes than his own. That night, as the stars emerged to speckle the velvet sky, Jim sat in his small, sparsely furnished room. The weight of the day lingered, pressing against his thoughts like the tide against the shore. For years, he had kept his most precious memories tucked away, hidden from the light, as if to protect them from fading. But tonight felt different. With careful hands, he opened the drawer where he kept his sparse treasures, a few letters, a tarnished pocket watch, and a photograph of Sarah, her smile as vibrant as the day it was captured. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the frame, the glass cool against his skin. He placed it gently on the small table beside his bed, where the moonlight streamed through the window, bathing her image in a soft, silvery glow. Her smile seemed to speak to him, as it always had, stirring memories of a woman whose courage had been a quiet fire. "You'd have done the same," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness. "You always knew when doing right mattered more than being safe." The words felt like a confession, a recognition of the strength she had instilled in him, the kind that didn't need applause or explanation. Sarah had been his compass, guiding him through storms both literal and figurative. And though she was gone, her presence lingered in the choices he made, in the way he carried himself through a world that often rewarded silence over action. Jim Walker was no longer just a fisherman, though he'd never sought to be anything more. In that fleeting salute from the sailors, in the quiet act of raising his hand in return, he had become something greater, a living testament to the power of doing what was right, not for glory, but because it was necessary. His life, marked by the simplicity of the sea, had woven itself into a larger story, one where righteousness needed no fanfare, only the courage to act. As he lay down to sleep, the photograph of Sarah watching over him, Jim felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The world might forget the quiet acts of good, but they rippled outward, touching lives across the divide, just as the waves reached his pier.